Hello everyone, welcome to this next video in the Best of GMAT series. My name is Shailesh and I'll be walking you through this particular question today. Today we have this sentence correction question. So as usual, pause the video, give it a try, and we'll go through this question after some time. All right, so what do we have to do here? So there is this particular sentence given to us. Let's call it the original sentence, and there are some variations of the underlined part, and we are supposed to find out the correct expression, grammatically, meaning wise, logical expression for the underlined part. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the original sentence. How can we read this? We can read it this way. Let's say in 1922, when Truman was almost 40 years old. Okay, so this time reference is this particular thing when a particular individual, Truman, was of certain age. What happened at the time? He was, now who's this he? This he is basically true. All right. So in a particular year, someone was what? What next? He was living in his mother-in-law's house. All right. Watching the haberdashery store. Now, haberdashery basically means men's accessories or a tailoring shop kind of a store. Okay. You don't have to know this particular word. It's perfectly all right if you don't know this word, because GMAT is not a vocabulary test, right? Also, this is not underlined, so you really don't have to worry about this. Okay. But basically, what is going on so far is that in 1922, a particular individual was living in someone's house, watching a particular store. And what kind of store? A store he opened 3 years earlier. Okay, so this basically is a modifier for that particular store, right? So it's not, this is extra information. This is not a necessary information for the store, right? And what about the store? Watching the haberdashery store of a particular kind go bankrupt. Okay, so basically, the complete thought is watching the store go bankrupt. All right. And what else? And he faced a future with no visible prospects. All right. Now, if you look at the structure, you will realize that in a particular time, someone was one, two, and three, right? So there is basically a list of three items. And as the rule of parallelism says, the three items in a list have to be grammatically similar, right? So we want all the terms to be living, watching, and facing. Now, why am I saying living, watching, and facing? Because living and watching are not underlined. That means they have to be correct. And the third item, facing, or rather this particular item he faced, should be facing. Okay. Now that we have understood to that level, let's go to the answer choices. The list should be living, watching, and facing, right? So there is no facing here. So this is out. There is no facing here as well. So this is also out. He was facing. All right, let's keep this facing, facing, facing. Okay. Uh, Fine. Let's keep this in the first iteration. Okay. In the second iteration, we'll look a little deeper. Now we see that this he is the subject that is repeated. We don't want it to be repeated. So he was doing one thing, doing second thing, doing third thing. That's the structure of it. I don't want the subject to be repeated. So again, that is out. Okay. Uh, Living in a house, watching a store that had opened, that he had opened. Okay. There is this extra had here. Okay. Like we always say, don't really worry about tenses on the GMAT. There are other bigger errors to catch. Had opened 3 years earlier, go bankrupt, and facing. Okay, so there is this and ing structure and ing structure here also. Right? So now we are left with D versus E. So let's compare D and E. So there is this had versus was, one thing. Okay, and is there any other usage, going bankrupt? Okay, so this seems okay. There's another thing, opening here. Right now, that gives me a clue that this has to be incorrect. Why? Because where I say, like, read this part. He opened 3 years earlier, go bankrupt, right? The store he was opening 3 years earlier. Okay, now that in itself doesn't make sense, because was opening indicates a continuous action, whereas that action must definitely have been over because the store was open 3 years earlier, right? So even if you don't really know the nitty gritty of tenses, purely on logical basis, you can say that 3 years earlier and was opening doesn't go hand in hand. Okay. Another thing is that open is an action that can happen only in particular time, right? So as in on a particular date, you open the store. It's an action that's actually, very instantaneous. It cannot keep on opening, right? I mean, tectonic plates, let's say, for example, right? They may be opening because that action happens over a long period of time. But here we are talking about store opening, which is at max 1 day's affair, right? So there is really nothing like he was opening a store. That's another way to look at it. Okay. So this logically, tense-wise, grammatically also doesn't make sense, although the parallelism is maintained, right? So the only answer choice that makes sense here is answer choice D. Okay. Now also look at this had, right? So we said in the beginning that we are not going to look into the tenses part, but just for conceptual clarity, let's look at this had. So the meaning here is that in 1922, he was doing this thing, and this action had happened 3 years earlier, right? So this action actually took place in 1990, right? So this is an earlier action, and that is why we are using a had here, right? A had basically shows when there are two actions, we use a had with an action that is even before the other action, even before, that kind of logic, right? So that is the use of had here. Okay. Anyway, to answer this question, the best answer choice here is D. So hope you had some bit of learning here, a couple of grammatical nuances, but more importantly, it is the meaning or the structure of the sentence that helps us in arriving at the correct answer choice. Happy learning.